Chapter 8, Human Population. The case study is about China's one-child policy, which was begun in 1979, and they did it because they were looking at a huge population that they weren't going to be able to feed or have jobs. And so they enforced it by rewards and punishments. So we have some positives and negatives that come out of this policy. The world decried this policy when it was first enacted. I was a little kid, and I remember hearing news reports, and my parents would tell me about what China did, and people were saying that it was such an awful thing. And it was, as far as a human rights standpoint. But they also saved their country from massive starvation. So, did the ends justify the means? Or is it somewhere in the middle? In environmental science, we have a lot of that. We have a lot of gray areas. Things are not always good or not always bad, but somewhere in the middle. So, the positives is that China was able to feed all of their people when they limited their growth. Less people means less environmental damage and enough jobs for their people. Now, there are some very serious negatives. China has a male preference society. That's a cultural thing. And so sometimes couples, especially in rural areas, they would abandon or kill a girl baby because they could try again for a boy. If you're only allowed to have one child and it's a girl, that for some people in rural areas where they still hold that tradition, that's not okay. So orphanages are full of abandoned girls. So because there are more girls than more males born because girls are killed or abandoned or adopted out of the country, like by Americans, you have more males than females in the country, so men often can't find a wife. And then also, there's not enough young people to support the old in terms of their form of Social Security and providing enough income for the old people and enough health care for the old people based on the backs of the young workers. We face that issue too in other aging populations, including the United States and European countries. On the bottom of page 190, know these charts and graphs. In the next 10 years, India will become the most populous country. India's growth is not stable. It is still growing. It's slowing down, but it is still growing, and they face some serious issues in India. Also know that human population growth is exponential. It has a J curve, like we have learned in previous chapters. There's a little bump here, a little drop. That would be the Black Death during the Middle Ages. The trigger for massive population growth here in the past 150 years or 200 years is the Industrial Revolution. Up here, know this particular factoid, that sub-Saharan Africa has the highest population growth. Do not ever write Africa, please write sub-Saharan Africa, because in the Saharan Desert they don't have rapid population growth up here in places like Egypt and Libya. It's sub-Saharan. Also know here on page 191 that the current growth rate is 1.2%. That seems low, but when we do the math, that means doubling in 58 years, and that means we have exponential growth. On page 192, we have these guys. Know who they are and what they said. Also on this page, know the definition of infant mortality rate. On the next page, 193, know what IPAT is. The impact to the environment is equal to the population size, the affluence, which is how much money, and the technology that is used. So the United States has a high IPAT. We're the third most populous nation. We are about a quarter of the size and population size of China, but we have more affluence in technology, which means that we have a greater impact on the environment. Turn all the way to 196. You do need to know the top 5 most populous nations in the world in order, so make sure you memorize this chart. And again, you can always pause the video if I go too fast. Another factoid here, make sure you know that Southeast Asia has the highest population density. Do not ever write Asia, because there's a lot of parts up here in Mongolia, in Siberia, that do not have a high population density. So in particular, it's India and Indonesia and Southeast and South China that have your highest population density, so you need to specifically say Southeast Asia. Okay, down here we have our age structure diagrams. Sometimes they're called population pyramids. We have this kind of structure with very pronounced triangle shape, and that is a rapidly increasing population. If you have straight-ish sides, you have stable, and if the sides kind of go in, you have decreasing. The 3 colors stand for, down here is pre-reproductive ages, reproductive ages, and post-reproductive ages. And those are important to know how many people are in what stage to know who's going to be having babies and increasing the population. Okay, up here we have a population pyramid of Canada and Nigeria. You can see up here that Nigeria is rapidly growing. Look how pronounced those sides are. It's crazy. Canada, what I want you to notice here is that it has large sides right here of people in their 50s and 60s. This is the post-World War II baby boom. So men came back from the war, and it was after the Depression, and families had a lot of children. And we have here this baby boom in Canada, but it's also in the US, and a lot of European countries also have the same baby boom. So because we had this big old baby boom in US and Europe, we have a graying population. And so the concern with a graying population is having less young workers to support the old folks, and it requires more health care. Now China, their graying population is not necessarily from a baby boom, but from their one-child policy. So all of those old people that were born before the one-child policy are getting old. And then there's less people in the younger populations. And so you can see their population pyramids up here. So you have this big influx of people that were born before, this is the post-baby boom. That's actually their baby boom here. And then this is their people born before their one-child policy, and these are the people born after the one-child policy. Okay, on the next page we have a concept. This is page 200. We have a concept of total fertility rate. Sometimes it's just called total fertility. This is the number of children a woman has. We measure it per woman because it is difficult to measure it per family, because women and men often have children with different partners or spouses. And so it's much more consistent to measure it per woman. So because I have 2 children, my TFR is 2. Now, replacement fertility is how many children is needed on average to keep a population stable. So in developed countries like us, Europe, Japan, which has good health care, it's 2.1. So that 0.1 accounts to the fact that unfortunately not all children live to be old enough to reproduce. So some of them die, and that 0.1 accounts for that. The 2 is replacing you and a male, a woman and a male, and then the 0.1 accounts for, again, sometimes we have death. So in developing countries which have higher death rates of children, your replacement fertility is going to need to be higher because more children will die before they reach reproductive ages due to things like bacterial infections, malaria, and things that we have vaccines for in the United States, things like polio and hepatitis and the measles even. So in the United States, we have vaccines, so kids don't die from those as readily. But in other countries that don't have the same access to vaccines, they do. On page 201, we have a chart. Make sure from this chart, this is the total fertility rate of different regions of the world. So Africa, on average, women have 4.7 children per woman. And you can see in Europe, it's 1.6. North America is 1.9. So we would, in the United States and Canada, we would be shrinking in population size because we are below replacement fertility, but we have immigration, and so that keeps our population growing in the U.S. Sorry, dropped my iPad. Apologize. Turn to page 202. Okay, so let's look at this chart up here. Fasten my pages down. This is the demographic transition chart, and you need to know every stage and what happens. So you need to know first these stages in order: pre-industrial, transitional, industrial, post-industrial, and you need to know what happens in each stage and why. Very important chart. The first stage, pre-industrial, birth and death rates are high. People had a lot of kids. They expected a lot of them to die. The death rate was high, accidents, diseases, and so you didn't have a growing population. The Industrial Revolution kicks in right here in different countries at different times. In some countries it's just starting. There's very few places in pre-industrial, maybe some villages, some tribes in deep forests in Amazon, but really most countries are in one of these stages. Transitional stage is the death rate drops because of better health care, better food production, vaccines, etc. But people still have a lot of kids because they don't realize the kids aren't dying anymore. Once they realize the kids aren't dying and the birth rate has dropped, then people start to go, oh, I don't need to have 7 children to make sure that 2 or 3 live. I can only have 2 or 3 and it would be fine. Also, usually in an industrial stage, girls get access to school, which lowers fertility rate, and access to birth control, and so the birth rate drops. And then post-industrial rates is you have birth rates and death rates are both low, and so the United States is in this, Europe's in this. Some books and in AP Human Geography, they have a 5th stage, which is the place where Europe's in, where it's actually below. So the death rate's higher than the birth rate, and so you have a shrinking population. But for APE's test, you just need to know the 4. So a concept called population momentum means that, okay, so you hit here and you have 0% growth rate, but all of the kids born here still have to have children, and so your population will grow. And that's called population momentum. It takes a generation for 0% growth after hitting the post-industrial stage, because your current generation of kids that was born in the industrial stage has to have children first. And so that's why you still grow after hitting 0%. Page 203, know this figure and term, which talks really about the reproductive age window for women. So first menstrual cycle and then menopause, women can have a lot of children, but it can be delayed through delaying childbirth and contraceptive use, which is done a lot in America and other developed countries. Women usually delay and have their children later, and they space them apart. Turn to page 206. We'll go ahead and pick up with 206 on the next video.